Another beautiful sunny California day. Just man and his best friend hanging out in the workshop. What more could a guy ask for? Speaking of man's best friend, where has that shop dog of mine run off to anyways? Oreo! Oreo! Oreo? Oreo? Where is that shop dog? Oreo? If she wasn't so cute, I'd fire her. Hi, I'm Brian Havens, and welcome to the Straightedge. This time, we'll learn how to make large cove moldings, like the cove molding on this display cabinet. And we're going to make that cove molding on the table saw. Now, why on earth would you want to make cove molding on a table saw? Why not just use a router table? Now, although you can get larger router bits, they're still limited in size. The largest cove molding you can make with a router bit like this is about 1.5 inches. And they require a pretty hefty router to do the job, and a router table is a must. On a table saw, cove moldings as wide as 3 inches and larger are a piece of cake. And unlike a router bit, which has a single profile, making cove molding on the table saw with just a few different settings can get us a lot of different styles of cove molding. So how on earth are we going to make cove molding on a table saw? The procedure involves installing some auxiliary fences on the table saw, and then passing the cove molding stock across the blade diagonally. The first pass is done with the blade raised about 1/16 of an inch, and with each subsequent pass, we raise the blade a little bit more until we get our final profile. If you're unfamiliar with this procedure, it probably sounds pretty crazy at first, sending a piece of wood across the table saw diagonally. I thought so too the first time I heard of it. But I assure you, if it's done correctly, it's a perfectly safe operation. Now, you may be familiar with some of the traditional ways of making cove molding on the table saw, but in this video, we're going to do a slightly alternative method. In traditional methods of making cove molding on the table saw, the profile is usually face down on the table saw, and then the stock is flipped up at about 45 degrees to give us our profile. In this video, however, I'll be using a piece of 8/4 stock. And then, after creating the profile on the table saw, I'm going to rip the piece in half to give us 2 pieces of cove molding. With this method, I find that I can get a larger variety of profiles, as well as profiles with a more extreme asymmetry. There's a few tools and materials that we're going to need to make cove molding on the table saw. First, we'll need a couple of pieces of something we can use for the auxiliary fence. I'm using a couple of kiln-dried 2x4s that I picked up from a local home center. I jointed each 2x4 on one face and on one edge. The jointed face will go towards the table saw, and the jointed edge will go towards the table saw blade. Next, we'll need a couple of sticks of wood that we can use for fence supports. I happen to have a couple pieces of ash lying around, but a 2x4 cut in half will do just fine. Some large heavy-duty clamps to clamp down the auxiliary fence. 2 pieces of plywood scrap or other sheet material, cut to the width of the molding that we want to make. And finally, a few playing cards. We'll use these as shims to make sure we don't make our fence too tight. When I set out to do research in making this video, I noticed there was a lack of terminology for making cove molding, so I took the liberty of establishing some terms. This will help me be clear about what I'm talking about. I'm calling the distance across the entire profile the width, even though later on I'll be ripping the cove molding stock down the middle to make 2 pieces of cove molding. The distance from the table saw to the highest point on the profile I'm calling the height. The two surfaces on the bottom of the Cove molding stock outside of the molding profile I'm calling the margin. The margin will be supporting the Cove molding stock as we pass it over the table saw blade. And the highest point in the profile I'm going to call the apex. Instead of diving right in on how to set up and make Cove molding, let's spend a few minutes to learn and understand how Cove molding works in the table saw and how the various adjustments will give us the various profiles that we want. There are 3 adjustments we can make to our setup that will affect the shape of our profile: the height of the table saw blade, the angle of the auxiliary fence, and the amount we tilt or bevel the blade. Let's start with the easiest one to understand: blade height. The blade height adjustment is straightforward. The more we increase the height of the table saw blade, the more we increase the height of the Cove molding. The second adjustment we can make is the angle of the auxiliary fence. That is the angle at which our auxiliary fence is going to guide our Cove molding stock across the table saw blade. As the angle of the auxiliary fence decreases, so does the width of our Cove molding. And finally, the adjustment that tends to be a little bit tricky to understand: the blade tilt. No blade tilt at all will give us a symmetrical Cove molding. But as the blade tilt increases, so does the asymmetry of our Cove molding. Just to summarize, our blade height gives us our Cove height, the fence angle gives us our Cove width, and the blade tilt gives us the amount of asymmetry in our profile. Okay, now that we have the theory out of the way, let's get down to business and look at the practical aspects of making Cove molding on the table saw. We'll start by setting up our fence. This procedure will require us to remove any riving knives or blade guards we have installed. If you want asymmetric molding, sight down the table saw looking at the horizon of the saw blade, and tilt the saw blade until you have a profile that you like. Since I'm going for the maximum asymmetry, I went ahead and tilted the blade all the way to 45 degrees. If you want symmetrical molding, you can skip this step altogether, leaving the saw blade at 0 degrees. Next, raise the saw blade to your desired molding height. I'm going for 1 1/8 inches. The final step is to set up the fence. Place a fence on either side of the saw blade, and place the spacers in between the 2 fences on either side of the saw blade. Then clamp the 2 spacers in between the fences. Light clamping pressure will do. We're just trying to keep the assembly together while we adjust the fence. Adjust the position and the angle of the fence until the front of the saw blade and the back of the saw blade just barely kiss the fences. Then mark the location of the left fence by drawing a pencil line directly onto the table saw. Unclamp and remove the spacer boards. Make a few marks equal to the distance of our margin away from our pencil line. The margins on my Cove molding are going to be 1/4 inch each. These marks determine the location of our left fence. Align the left fence against those marks and clamp the fence to the table saw. To set the right fence, start by retracting the blade all the way into the table saw. And place the Cove molding stock in between the 2 fences. Place a few playing cards between the Cove molding stock and the right fence. And sandwich the Cove molding stock in between the 2 fences with light clamping pressure. With the right fence in place, we can now clamp it to the table saw. Because the table saw fence can get in the way, Clamping the right fence can be a little bit tricky, and you may have to get a little bit creative. You may also find that the topography on the underside of the table saw can make it difficult to place the clamps. You can usually solve this problem with some extra clamping pads. With the right fence clamped to the table saw, we can now remove our Cove molding stock and the playing cards. For added safety and for keeping the fence from flexing, I like to add some extra fence supports. The fence supports should be just touching the fence. We don't want to induce the very thing we're trying to avoid by adding some flex into the fence. Test your setup by placing the Cove molding stock between the two fences and making sure that the stock slides smoothly along the fence. Also make sure that the fence is not too loose. A little bit of play is okay. Your final setup should look something like this. Time to make some Cove molding. For the first pass, raise the blade about 1/16 of an inch. Place the Cove molding stock in between the fences and turn on the table saw. Then, using push blocks, gently push the stock through the saw blade. You'll want to maintain firm downward pressure when doing this, but don't overdo it. Repeat this process, raising the saw blade just a little bit for each pass, until you reach the final height of your Cove molding profile. While our woodworker makes a few more passes, let's take a moment to look at some additional safety issues when making Cove molding on the table saw. There are 3 safety issues that you want to keep in mind when making Cove molding on the table saw. To help me remember these, I came up with the acronym MAL. The M is for margins, as in pay attention to the margins. As we raise the blade on each subsequent pass, the margins will get smaller and smaller. What we don't want to happen is to have the margins disappear altogether. That would result in our Cove molding stock plunging into the table saw blade, and that could get ugly. The A stands for apex. That is, pay attention to the apex. Just like the margins, as we increase the height of the saw blade on each subsequent pass, the distance between our apex and the top of our molding stock gets smaller. What we don't want to happen is to have that distance get too small and have the Cove molding stock collapse on top of the table saw blade. That too could get ugly. For this reason, I usually start with stock that's oversized, and then trim off the excess later on. And finally, the L is for light, as in take light passes. Just remember, we're putting lateral pressure on the saw blade, and too much pressure will cause the blade to deflect more than we want to. Again, that could get ugly. Easy does it is the best policy here. Once again, that's M for margins, A for apex, and L for light, as in light passes. Let's check back with our woodworker and see how he's doing. Looks like one more pass will do it. And here's a tip. As the saw blade gets higher, we expose more cutting surface, so back off on how much you raise the blade as the saw blade gets higher. And there's our final pass. Let's take a look at the profile. A nice asymmetric profile. Making Cove molding on the table saw leaves a surface that's quite rough. So I like to clean it up a little bit at this point to get a better look. To do this, I'll use any number of curved card scrapers, depending on the profile. And sometimes I'll even need to make some custom shaped card scrapers. There's just 2 more steps till we finish our Cove molding. You may have noticed that I use oversized stock. That's to avoid weakening the apex. Now it's time to remove that extra material. The most obvious way to do this is to plane it down to final thickness. You could also remove the bulk of the material by resawing it on the bandsaw or on the table saw. A word of caution though if you decide to resaw on the table saw. Make sure your fence or an installed auxiliary fence is tall enough to support both the margins. I wouldn't recommend resawing on the table saw unless both margins can be supported. Whichever procedure you decide to use, be sure to use light passes when doing your final dimensioning on the planer. It's much less likely that the apex will collapse during planing, and the results will be much less catastrophic, but still we want to be careful. The final step in making our cove molding is to rip our cove molding stock in half. This last step may seem like a mundane step, but this is the step where I reveal just how flexible this method of making cove molding is. Consider the profile of the cove molding that I made in this video. Should I rip it exactly in half, or should I rip it at some different width? As it turns out, depending on where we rip the stock in half, has a significant effect on the style of our cove molding. And you can even use the two halves to form a composite molding. Now how cool is that? And if you're only interested in the more asymmetric side of the cove molding, there's a way to get matching halves. Simply flip the cove molding stock on each pass end for end, and make a second pass. The results will be matching halves of asymmetric cove moldings. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning how to make cove molding on the table saw, and that you'll be able to employ these techniques on a project of your own in the near future. Now, if you do add cove molding to a project of your own, please send pictures. I'd love to show them off on my website. I'm Brian Havens. Thanks for watching.